Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The 9th of July is Constitution Day. 125 years ago, on the 9th of July 1900, Queen Victoria gave her royal assent to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900. This is the British Act of Parliament in which the Commonwealth Constitution sits as Section 9. Many Australians would be aware that the Commonwealth Constitution was drafted and approved in Australia. It was debated in the course of constitutional conventions in the 1890s and was eventually approved by the people of each of the Australian colonies by way of a referendum. But most people would probably be a bit foggy about what happened after those referendums were passed in each of the colonies. The Constitution, along with what are known as the covering clauses, so those are the first 8 sections of that British Act of Parliament, were sent to the United Kingdom for enactment, along with a delegation of people representing the Australian colonies. Now, the job of the delegates was to have that Constitution Bill ushered through the Westminster Parliament without change. The delegation was made up of Edmund Barton, who represented New South Wales, Alfred Deakin from Victoria, Charles Kingston from South Australia, Philip Fish, Tasmania, and James Dixon from Queensland. Western Australia had not yet decided to join the Federation, but it did still participate through its Agent General in London. The delegates felt strongly that as the Constitution had been approved by the people, its terms could not be changed. But the British government saw things quite differently. It didn't feel bound at all by referendums that had happened in the Australian colonies. When the British government decided to introduce changes to the Constitution Bill before introducing it into the Westminster Parliament, Deakin was furious. He fired back a letter which said, "To alter our work after we have finished it by a mere exercise of overlordship would be an inconsiderate, impolite, and offensive act of supremacy. There ought not now be the least tampering with a measure which has run such a gauntlet of criticism and secured at last such an overwhelming verdict in its favour from our parliaments and peoples." The British proposed 4 main changes. 3 were to the covering clauses and concerned what the British perceived as an attempt to give Australia a measure of independence from Britain. They thought that a definition of colony in the covering clauses was intended to prevent the new federation from being treated as a British colony so that it would no longer be subject to overriding British laws, known as laws of paramount force. The British were concerned that one of the other covering clauses would also allow Australian laws to override British laws about shipping. They were also very suspicious about another provision in the covering clauses that said that the Constitution Act bound the Crown, as it might therefore be seen as limiting the executive powers of the British government. So, how did the Australian delegates deal with this? They claimed, rather disingenuously it must be said, that they had never intended that the colony of the Commonwealth of Australia would be independent or free from British laws of paramount force. But now that the British have raised the issue, well, perhaps there ought to be a debate about releasing Australia and Canada and the other self-governing colonies from these colonial shackles. Now, the British really did not want to get into a broader fight on this issue with their other colonies, and they backed off. Both sides then agreed simply to drop the definition of colony, the reference to binding the Crown, and the provision about shipping from the covering clauses. For the Australian delegates, these were not significant matters, and cutting them out did not involve any change to the substance of the Constitution itself. What the delegates wanted to avoid was any express provision that would prevent the future development of independence for Australia, and this they achieved. The biggest fight, however, was about appeals from Australian courts to what we call the Privy Council, which is technically called the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. The British wanted to protect their commercial interests in the colonies by knowing that ultimate appeals could be decided in Britain by a British court. The Australians, on the other hand, wanted local Australian matters to be determined in Australia because they very much doubted that a British court would understand an entrenched federal constitution of a colony across the other side of the world. The British removed the section in the substance of the Constitution, section 74, which dealt with final appeals, and inserted in the covering clauses an overriding provision for appeals to the Privy Council from state Supreme Courts and the High Court. This, again, infuriated the Australian delegates. After much wrangling and negotiation, a compromise was reached. The High Court of Australia would be the final court of appeal for local constitutional questions concerning the respective powers of the Commonwealth and the states, unless the High Court gave its consent to a further appeal to the Privy Council. In other cases, including ones concerning trade, shipping and commercial matters, appeals could be taken to the Privy Council, including from state Supreme Courts. Alfred Deakin recorded in his book, The Federal Story, which by the way is a very good read if you ever get the chance to do so, what actually happened once the delegates had achieved this breakthrough. They left their meeting with Joseph Chamberlain, the Colonial Secretary, in his office in the Westminster Parliament, and then went into another room. And then Deakin said this: "When the door closed upon them and left them alone, they seized each other's hands and danced hand in hand in a ring around the centre of the room to express their jubilation." Was this actually true? Personally, I find it hard to believe, but then why would Deakin have written it? He was there and I wasn't, but it does sound a little odd to me. There is, of course, a lot more to this story. The British parliamentary debates and all the communications between the delegates and the British government were collected, and they're published in this book from 1901. Quite hard to find a second-hand copy of it, but if you do, again, it's a very interesting read. After the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act was finally passed by both houses of the Westminster Parliament on the 5th of July 1900, it then went to Queen Victoria to receive royal assent. Queen Victoria gave her assent to the bill on the 9th of July. According to Quick and Garran, at the request of the delegates, the Queen signed her assent to the bill by way of royal commission in duplicate, so that one copy could be given to Edmund Barton to take back to Australia, along with the pen, the inkstand and the table used by the Queen when she signed it. The other copy would be kept with the British parliamentary records. Royal assent was then formally announced in the House of Lords later that day, which was apparently received with cheers from the Lords and the members of the House of Commons who'd been summoned to the bar of the House. Now, here's a copy of the Royal Commission that records Queen Victoria's assent to the Constitution. For those who are obsessed with seals, it's got a fantastic one there, hasn't it? As always, Queen Victoria signed at the top. It's a bit hard to see, probably in this photo, but that's where her signature is. Although, of course, some people still persist with conspiracy theories that none of the documents signed by monarchs for centuries are valid because they signed at the top and not at the bottom. Now, what does all that writing say? Why do you need so many words to say you assent to an act? Well, if you really want to know, you can read a typed transcript of it on the Founding Documents website. But essentially, it's just a lot of words saying that Queen Victoria gave her assent to the bill outside Parliament rather than doing so orally in the House of Lords. It states that she could not conveniently be present in our royal person in the higher house of our said Parliament, being the accustomed place for the giving of our royal assent. In fact, she didn't like attending Parliament. She didn't like everybody staring at her. So in practice, she gave assent elsewhere by granting a royal commission to commissioners who would then present that assent to Parliament. Queen Victoria stated in the commission that we do give and put our royal assent to the said Act and to all articles, clauses and provisions therein contained, and have fully agreed and assented to the said Act, which makes her agreement pretty clear, even though she wasn't actually very keen on the word Commonwealth with all its Republican overtones. If you read Queen Victoria's diary from that day, the 9th of July, it was a fine day and she was at Windsor. She drove to Frogmore for breakfast, she visited family members, she had a good turn around the garden, and then she met with her Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, with whom she discussed foreign affairs, including China and India, and she told him who she thought should serve as the Commander-in-Chief in India. She then dined with a number of ambassadors, but there's not a word mentioned in there about assenting to the Commonwealth Constitution and having to part with her pen and her inkstand and her desk. What might still be important to, well, some of us, 125 years later, was not so important as breakfast and taking a turn around the garden to Queen Victoria. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and a very happy Constitution Day to you. Goodbye.